Welcome everybody again to our GIA seminar on how to recover from state capture. I'm going to hand over to our moderator and provocateur for the day, Daniel Kaufman. Danny, over to you.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks to all the people joining. I see that already this is has a lot of interest, and the eminent panelists we have with us. So it's good morning, good afternoon, and evening to you all from around the world. It is my privilege to be the provocateur in today's GIA's interactive roundtable of this very relevant and current topic of recovery from state capture with the eminent panelists and so many knowledgeable participants. Two quick comments first. First, on what is state capture? I will not dare to get into the literature and into the definitions, because this session is not about concepts or research so much, but about what to do. And I want to get quickly to the panelists and their experience. So I will only mention that the whole field of governance is very rich and very creative in related concepts and terminology. There is administrative corruption, petty corruption, grand corruption, kleptocracy, strategic corruption, and there is, of course, state capture. They're related but distinct concepts. In short, let us think about kleptocracy as a rule by a thief. Focus on venal state leaders, of course, that work. Or about administrative traditional corruption in getting around the existing rules of the game, illegally skirting the law, while state capture is about rewriting or even writing the rules of the game for the benefit of the few. And this capture can take place by powerful non-state actors, such as oligarchs, or by a state leader and related high-level politician, or quite common nowadays, by both colluding. South Africa is an interesting case, Brazil, and there are others. And state capture can be legal because captors shape the laws, write the laws to serve the interests. So it is not about corrupt individual transactions, but it is systemic, it is about networks, it differs from traditional study of corruption in that state capture is at the intersection of high-level systemic corruption and the undermining of democratic norms and institutions. And the second observation is that significant progress in the study of state capture over decades already, and particularly this past decade, and you have been involved in this, and panelists and others, has evolved significantly, including studying who are the captors, who are the enablers, the objects of capture, the process, the consequences. But much less progress has taken place in understanding what it takes to stop it, and then what it takes to recover from it, and then to put guardrails to prevent a recurrence in the future. We will focus on these new areas for which we will draw on the experiences of Hungary, Sri Lanka, South Africa, and a few other countries by the eminent panelists. Our panelists will be commenting on questions I will be asking during the first part of the session. After a couple of quick rounds of brief questions and answers, we will open the discussion to questions from the audience. So quickly, first, introducing each of the panelists with us today in the order of which the panelists will comment on the first round of questions. I'm not doing full justice to the impressive credential for the sake of time. We have with us Joseph Peter Martin, the Executive Director of Transparency International in Hungary, and a senior lecturer at the Corvinus University of Budapest. And we have Sanghita Gunaratne, the head of governance and anti-corruption and veritas research in Sri Lanka, and also high-level positions, Transparency International there, and with a legal background. Then we have Jonathan Tim, the head of the Programs Management Office in the Office of the Presidency on State Capture Response, South Africa. And last but certainly not least, and you saw her already, the boss, Liz David Barrett, a noted researcher in state capture and many other governance, political science issues, is a director, Center of Study of Corruption at the University of Sussex, and also leads the GIA's program, an FCDO-funded research program of which this is part of. So let's go to Joseph now on Hungary. Starting the panel interaction. I will park for a bit, just for a little bit, the questions on recovery of state capture yet, which is a focus of this session, because you in Hungary are just beginning that era in Hungary. And at any rate, prior to recovering from state capture, one has to put a stop to it first, which is really hard. But you have shown the art of the possible after 16 Orban years. So, what, in your view, are the main couple of lessons learned from these recent seismic, earthquake-like developments in Hungary, resulting in the ouster of Orban, which may in fact be relevant for other countries? On to you, Joseph. You may need to unmute, Joseph.
Sorry about that. So thank you very much, Daniel. I am delighted to be here, and I will try to answer your question very briefly. So Hungary was indeed a prime case of state capture, as TI Hungary put it already back in 2013, so 13 years ago. So the Orban regime can be labeled as a state capture regime, and the Orban regime, as you said, Daniel, lasted from 2010 until 2016, so until 2026, sorry, so until this year. So it meant the control of the state institutions, dismantling the checks and balances, instrumentalizing the policymaking and legislation, and also to help to enrich the cronies and oligarchs of the regime. Corruption became the part of the regime. Partly that's why we call it state capture. We can call it also systemic corruption. By this we mean that lots of state money and public assets were transferred to cronies and oligarchs. The state capture in Hungary was rather a political than an oligarchical state capture, because the enrichment took place during the regime. So not the powerful oligarchs who bought themselves into the power, but an obscure network of politicians and oligarchs took over the power and took over the state institution, instrumentalized the legislation that helped to enrich the government close stakeholders. And in the center of this network was Prime Minister Orban. So what are the lessons learned? I would mention three things. One is that in such kind of autocracy, which Hungary was, state capture can't be dismantled from within the system. So in order to dismantle state capture, in order to end state capture, we need a government change, or more importantly, even a regime change. So the regime should be brought down. The second lessons learned, I would say, is that we need a unified opposition. Of course, country by country, it would depend on the nature of the electoral law. But in case of Hungary, because of the electoral law, we needed this unified opposition. So we needed as many people to gather against the regime and against the Orban government as it is possible. For a long time, the opposition in Hungary was fragmented and weak, and 2 years ago, surprisingly, a former insider of Fidesz turned against the regime frontally and established a new party, the so-called Tisza party. And after 2 years, Péter Magyar and his Tisza party won the election with a landslide majority. The interesting thing about this party is that nominally it is a conservative party, but behind this label, there is a very diverse electorate from left through liberals until the right. even more, the conservatives, according to surveys, are in minority behind the TISA party. So the majority of the TISA party voters are left-wing or liberal voters. And the third lessons learned is that we need to put corruption in the forefront of the political agenda, and to link corruption as much as it is possible with the quality of public services and the economic performance. In Hungary, the public services have been deteriorating very, very strikingly in the recent years. I mentioned here the healthcare and the education situation, and also in terms of economic performance, Hungary has become, unfortunately, the poorest country in the EU when it comes to individual consumption. When it comes to GDP, Hungary currently is the fourth from behind. So all these three aspects resulted in this electoral revolution, which took place on 12th of April. We usually use this term electoral revolution because the amount of vote was unexpectedly high for TISA. They in the party list they won 53% of the votes, and in the individual constituencies they won 96 out of 106. So there is a promise now not only of the government change, which already took place, but also of the regime change. So the nature of the whole regime can be changed, and we foresee the redemocratization of the Hungary in the near future. And the last aspect, what I would like to mention, is that there is a very quick erosion of the former deep state. This is a very positive surprise. We could foresee previously that this deep state will somehow resist to democratic endeavors, but it seems not to be the case. It seems to be that the economic power of the former regime is eroding very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you. I will not be surprised that Sangeeta will go next there. The issue of the economy may also come up, which is a feature in state capture. And when we continue later, we'll park it for later, this issue of regime change that you mentioned, which is essential, it's so interesting and important. Yet, in the case of Hungary, it was an insider, in a sense, that engineered that. So the question arises whether that makes it perhaps a bit more feasible and easier. Of course, an insider that decided to jump ship, but it's totally different than other cases that we're going to look into now. So we go to Sangeeta now, and given your background, experience, and relevance, that the role that you have played in the Sri Lanka case, which experience, as we know, the Rajapaksa dynastic capture in two periods, first 2005 to 15, then more recently 19 to 22. What, in your view, were the most important elements of resistance to that second period of Sri Lanka's state capture, more recent one, which became so acute during the parliamentary election in 2020? And I know you were involved, and you had prophetic remarks at the time, and so on. So on to you. Feel free also, please, Sangeeta, to highlight what a main lesson for other countries may be from your experience.
Thank you, Danny. Happy to be here, and quite a privilege to listen to everyone else also and share thoughts. So Sri Lanka also experienced a similar kind of state capture by the political elite rather than oligarchical, capture or capture from the outside of the state. So I want to talk about three main responses, three main ways of resisting state capture that we saw in Sri Lanka. And one is litigation, the second is elections, and the third would be the protests, obviously, right? So in terms of litigation, um, I know that we're talking in state capture of situations where the laws themselves are changed, right? And Sri Lanka also experienced that, the capture of the legislature and legal processes itself. However, there were certain elements of the law that still remain, that had been there for so long, that were accepted, like the option of public interest litigation through the fundamental rights jurisdiction of the country. So, one big space that was used by the people at the point when the executive and the legislature had been captured and were widely perceived as having been captured was resorting to litigation. Because with the courts, we had this sense that there needed to be a reasoning, a reasoned decision that came out rather than mere action. And so, Sri Lankan civil society, even where the state refused to prosecute corruption or deal with it, Sri Lankan civil society went to court on instances of corruption and also on instances of bad governance. So, the economic crisis case is one of the biggest examples where civil society, while these people were still in power, while the president prime minister was still from this family, their cronies were in power, civil society went to court and went to the highest court in the country and said these people are responsible for the economic crisis in the country and laid it out in factual terms, questioning why the dollar was pegged at a certain rate, questioning why there was a delay to go to the IMF, questioning why Sri Lanka's debts were paid out of reserves against expert advice, leading to Sri Lanka basically coming to its knees and not being able to, afford petrol and fuel and electricity. Um, so this was one of the key things that worked. So it's this the lesson for everyone here, I guess, is to understand the available options, do an assessment of what internal options, domestic options may still be available, in spite of the fact that you're seeing, everything crashing around you. So, for example, we also see the importance of the audit function, and some of this might end up seeming quite boring at the end of the day. But the fact that the National Audit Office continued to document where there were transgressions. So using options like that becomes really important. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the importance of elections, right? So um, irrespective of the same family, the same party coming into power over and over again, we've had brief periods of respite where other parties have been able to take control through a legitimate electoral process. So, but we've seen though in that in between period after the protests happened and President Gotabaya Rajapaksa was forced to resign, between that period and the next formal elections that were held uh, in 2024, there was this sense of whether elections will be postponed. Local government elections were postponed and only held later. Provincial council elections are currently postponed. So it's really important, even in the smaller to the larger elections, that we leave no space for elections to be postponed, because once you start going down that road, for any reason, even in as critical an issue as the need for economic recovery, that we don't make space for elections to be messed with in any sense. And of course, the third thing that I'd like to talk about that everyone knows is the importance of protests. So when elections hadn't worked, when legitimate, not legitimate, but public dissent hadn't worked, people took to the streets, youth took to the streets. It was an apolitical movement of an array of a range of people coming to the streets and then peacefully protesting. And it was beautiful to watch because the protests provided something for people to rally around. And that built a lot on the work that civil society had done over time. It was strangely gratifying for us to watch from the sidelines while people were now on the streets talking about asset recovery, asset declaration, conflicts of interest, corruption, things that were usually only talked about by a few people in terms of the technical responses to the problem of corruption. So the importance of protest cannot be undervalued. So in terms of lessons for other countries, I just like to say in terms of economic recovery, when it came to Sri Lanka going to the IMF for assistance in its 17th program now in Sri Lanka, what was important was that the IMF also had something to build on because civil society over so many years, 20, 30 years, had worked on bodies of, reform packages, whether it's on asset recovery, beneficial ownership, money laundering, asset declarations, constitutional structures, all of that. There were lobbies of people, campaigns that knew exactly what they wanted. So that's also a clear lesson for us to learn. And I'll stop here. I know I've taken longer than expected. Thanks.
Thanks, Ankita. This is just so important, relevant. I hope it's not lost that the lessons that you are explicitly discussing and implicitly telling the story of what happened are also being heard in many other countries, including very powerful ones like the United States, for instance, right now. So I think this is very relevant. We'll go, and this focus on elections and civil society is just so crucial. And in looking for the options, for the windows of opportunity, which always exist, but sometimes we're too depressed to look for them during the process. So thank you for that. Into South Africa now, which very quickly at the personal level played an extremely important role in my work too, because when we started with Joel Hellman, this is 30 years ago, mid-90s to 2005 and so on, the focus was really in post-transition economies of the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet things. Well, lo and behold, at the end of 2016, there's a release of the public prosecutor report on state capture in South Africa. So they basically took that overall framework and made it very clear this is not just a post-Soviet type of challenge. And of course, in some sense, South Africa was a country in transition, a very different type of one. Academics also were involved at the time. And in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan Thim, but I remember that in 2017, state capture becomes the South African Word of the Year. Right? And so you have already a decade of post-capture experience. So we turn our focus now to the recovery of state capture. So, Jonathan, given your background, your role, experience, and the relevance of the South Africa case, what, in your view, are the couple of most important lessons learned from the South Africa case in terms of the actions, the initiatives taken for recovering from state capture, which may, in fact, help prevent its recurrence in the future? And mention also the most important, please, pending challenge, in your view, for South Africa at this stage in this post-capture recovery.
Thanks very much. Yes, it's interesting to think about it as being a decade in the post-capture period because it doesn't happen as night turns to day. It's much more incremental, the experience. So I think in dealing with state capture and the recovery thereof, the central difficulty is that the institutions that you must use to drive the reform are the very ones that were captured and degraded. So you have this paradoxical situation. You're reforming a system with the tools of that same system. So the reform is non-linear. It advances, it retreats, context shifts, new opportunities are created. However, the political space in which this is all happening has a very linear structural condition. Elections, um, media cycles, political competition. So the task is to hold enough internal coherence within the reform effort and public support to balance those and to keep moving while working in an environment that is kind of is compromised. That's the nature of the state capture challenge. So I think I want to highlight two things that I think really in looking at it from a bit of a bird's eye view, and there's so much to share, but I think the role of the commission is so important. We had it wasn't the public prosecutor that it initially produced the report. It was the public protector, which is a constitutional. We have a chapter 9 in our constitution, which has various bodies set up to protect democracy and protect society against excesses of power. So that's the public protector. Very instrumental, was looking into abuse of power by the president and allegations around capture. She couldn't finish this work because her term ended. And she made in her recommendations um, a, a recommendation that there needed to be a judicial commission of inquiry and that the president needed to establish that and the president needed to report to the parliament on what his response would be. That went to court. The courts played a critical role in determining that the recommendations of this constitutional body were in fact legally binding, which then opened the door for the requirement for this commission, which is popularly known as the Zondo Commission or State Capture Commission. It ran for 4 years. It was televised. Social media was another very important component of this because every day's session was then archived on YouTube or on the commission's website. Transcripts were available. So this huge body of publicly available knowledge emerged. Similarly, the president's response, the requirement of the initial recommendations was that the president respond to Parliament. So there was a public document of the commitments made. That was another critical component where in a in a reform. Apologies, I'm just recovering from flu, so my voice is not at its best. But this having a document with the status of being the president's response submitted to Parliament in the public domain has been a really critical instrument to navigate because the context shifts and the space narrows in particular areas sometimes, and you then have this written commitment that you can use to effect a kind of accountability from a less powerful position in the political ecosystem. So, we've had, again, there's a new commission running for 9 months now called the Lanka Commission, and that's looking at criminality, political interference, and corruption in the criminal justice system. And that was on the back of an explosive press conference by a senior police officer alleging massive infiltration. It's allowed the country to enter into the shadow world of the security services, which was an area that the Zondo Commission didn't really touch on. Again, this iterative approach, iterative recognition that conditions are always changing is so important. This commission has now turned into one of the top, the most popular things on television. It's surprising to me how many people are fascinated and following this like a soap opera. You are having senior officials having to be cross-examined on their WhatsApp conversations, and it is really alarming and riveting. So, in this respect, initially the discourse was around the billion rand that was spent on the Zondo Commission as a waste of time, a talk shop, but in the past 4 years, that commission has paid for itself 17 times over. the commission costs R1 billion or $60 million, but the recovery to date and continues is over $1 billion, directly linked to the evidence. But I think it's more important the shift that happens in the context of the political ecosystem, the political economy. It's educational for people to understand what's right and wrong, what has consequences, what culture shift. So I think the other area that I think I would really highlight as being really important, it comes from this president's response, and the work that I've been very much involved in is taking this published response and turning it into a mechanism and a set of institutional arrangements that can build an alternative platform for advancing the reform. So we have 60 actions in the president's response, which we track on a quarterly basis, and we go to cabinet and report on this. And the president's response commits to public publication of progress. It creates an alternative center of power in this process and allows us really to keep pushing into the space that becomes available. Things don't, you might achieve something at the level of a kind of fairly compliance depth. Conditions change and you can achieve a deeper, more substantial level of reform. So iteration is the key thing. I think the challenge remains the legacy in the organizations, in the state, in the incentives within the state system, the cultures that build up over time. And I don't think this is a sort of anomaly so much. There's a lot of continuity from the colonial and apartheid period that got reanimated and re-empowered during the state capture period. So the efforts to transform from an extractive, hierarchical, authoritarian state setup to a democratic, people-centered constitutional democracy, there was still a lot of that legacy remaining in the system that the state capture extractive system could just reinvigorate. So I think that's singularly the biggest challenge of how to shift that culture to build resilience from a system of obedience and loyalty to performance and accountability. I'm sure I've taken too long.
That's very insightful, Jonathan, and thank you. And just for everybody to know, we may not be that engaged with South Africa. When you talk about the first commission, you were referring to the Zondo Commission, clearly, which and the way you described also the broader impact and benefits, both awareness, education, and so on, are very important. While at the same time, my recollection is right because I had some involvement with it too. There were 1,200 plus mentions of who should be prosecuted, right? And those have not largely happened, especially at high level. So the whole issue of the follow-up on the rule of law issue, kind of ironically, it goes to your point. That was part of the object of capture in the first place, right? The regime under state capture, which leads, and we will follow up on this, but this leads to Liz, because you have been doing such relevant research with colleagues studying a number of countries. So I will ask you, which in some sense it comes up in Jonathan's comment about the trade-off challenge that you bring up, which is often underemphasized in strategizing by both reformist side, the activists, and so on. Because one very important element in recovering from state capture may undermine progress on another that reformists also consider a priority. They're not all complementary, as we tend to assume sometimes. So specifically to you, what would be a top trade-off, or two, if you mention them briefly, which reformists and activists need to be mindful of in the post-capture era, in the countries with us today, plus others like you have studied with others like Madagascar, And then tell us in brief what, in your view, should be the priority component to forge ahead with versus which one to deprioritize, not to give so much priority in such trade-off. Because I know sometimes it's an abstract concept, but it's so important for progress and action on the ground eventually.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. And fascinating to listen to all of our country experts, talking about the different experiences. What we're trying to do in this research project under GIACE is to learn from all of these different experiences about just how to approach this. When you get a moment, a window of opportunity for reform, how to make sure that you use that time wisely and not squander it. So one of the trade-offs we see is something, again, that's already been mentioned, between this, whether you prioritize backward-looking justice and sort of retribution, or rather forward-looking prevention. And quite often when there's a change, there is a real clamour for justice, for going after the perpetrators of capture and putting them behind bars, heads on sticks. But at the same time, there are some costs to that, and it can often be quite difficult. So, one problem is that you get backlash. If you look at the case of Guatemala, for example, Bernard Arevalo came in with on an anti-corruption ticket. Very quickly identified many procurement contracts that had a lot of irregularities and wanted to move forward with those, but was blocked by an attorney general who was still loyal to the previous regime. If you look at South Africa, as you've mentioned, there was a lot of demand for prosecutions, and very, very few have actually gone ahead. Even if you've got the absolutely best conditions for going ahead with prosecutions, it's a very, very slow process, and there's a real risk of failure because, of course, the law enforcement institutions, even if they're not actually still captured, which they may well be, there's a problem of just collecting evidence about something which was, often, as we know, in state capture, practices are legalized, or it can be very difficult to get the evidence around them. So there's a real tension there, I think, between meeting this kind of clamour for justice versus a sort of potential risk that gets bogged down. It doesn't achieve anything. It spends a lot of time. It's a very slow result. Or if you don't manage to get the prosecution, those people turn around and say, you see, we didn't do anything wrong. They weren't able to prosecute us. So there are a lot of risks involved there. Another one is around what do you do with those politicized institutions? So we know that the way that capture happens is that the oligarchs or the captors put into state-owned enterprises and into key ministry positions loyal allies who are essentially going to implement policy in the way that they want. They're going to make decisions that favour their cronies and hand out state assets or regulatory decisions in ways that favour the capture. So what do you do with those? You want to get rid of these political appointees because you can't really trust them under the new regime to deliver impartially. At the same time, you don't want to strip out all of your institutional capacity. Jonathan very eloquently raised this in talking about the fact that the institutions that were captured are also the ones that you need to drive reform. And I was interested in what Jozef was saying there about this being dismantled quickly in Hungary. Very interested in, why he thinks that's happening so fast and what we might be able to learn from that. So there's a couple of, really big tensions there, I think. Another one, or you asked about a priority rather. So I've talked about state capture as having these three pillars. The third pillar is the one around disabling accountability institutions. So captors, especially if they're working in democracies, in order to be able to proceed with capture, they need to disable the media, the audit institutions, the courts, civil society. So in terms of if thinking about a priority for reform post-capture, I think the really important thing is to get those institutions back up and running quickly, because then they're going to hold you to account while you're doing some of the other things that you really need to do. And this does sort of bring in a little bit of another tension that we have, which is how much do you build in and bring in civil society? So I think Sankita and Yuzhif both talked about the importance of using civil society and bringing in their expertise, importance of having a wide coalition. At the same time, wide coalitions can also be fragmented, unstable. So can we think about clever ways of doing this, perhaps, putting pressure from civil society through other organizations like the IMF, as also happened in Sri Lanka, to also make sure that the process doesn't get lost. So there's a sort of inclusivity versus control dilemma there too.
Thanks much, Liz. Among other things, your focus on accountability institutions and their dismantling during state capture, or worse, in some countries now we can observe that they're being weaponized against the opposition, right? So they're not just dismantled, but they can be weaponized. But that's such an important focus, which will raise follow-up questions. Maybe others will take it up, and then we'll try to come back quickly. If accountability means that somebody has to be accountable, somebody being accountable is that rule of law has to work. So the whole issue of impunity and not prosecuting the past comes back, which you mentioned obviously as a challenge and as a part of a trade-off. So what could be the bridge or the sweet spot of rebuilding this accountability institution where rule of law is at the core of it? But what it may mean that at least some prosecutions may happen, because where is legitimacy in the eyes of the public, so will come. Otherwise, if they see that, if they perceive complete impunity, which also may be a problem in the future, because if people feel that there is a little price being paid for that, then what? Let me turn, and maybe Joseph would comment on this, but also, but in the context of Hungary being such a focus today, and let's try to be very brief, because then we'll go to the audience and come back. In the coming couple of years, in your view, what should be the top priority, or two maximum, but just mention them, to recover from state capture in Hungary? And what you consider the main possible obstacle to that?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to hear your thoughts, and it's really very interesting and makes me think even more thorough about the Hungarian case. So my short answer to your question, Daniel, would be that re-establishment of the rule of law and to pursue meaningful anti-corruption reforms. So these are the two main priorities. But obviously, it's easier to say than to do, as Liz also pointed out. And obviously, there will be in the Hungarian case as well some trade-offs. So currently, what the new Hungarian government wants is quite clear. So there is a political will to bring the corrupt perpetrators of the former regime to court. So there is this kind of backward-looking justice endeavor. Fueled by the popular support, the people want these corrupt perpetrators see in prison, to put it very simply and bluntly. And also there is a strong will on behalf of the government, also supported by the popular will, to recover the assets, the stolen assets. Enormous public money and public wealth were transformed transferred to cronies and oligarchs. In other words, were stolen. So these assets need to be restored. But obviously, these are very challenging tasks. And the main impediment I would say, behind that currently is that the heads of the institutions, of state institutions, are those people who were nominated by the Fidesz regime and who were loyal to the former and failed Fidesz regime. And it's very right what Liz you asked, why I was saying that the deep state was eroding so much. I was referring more to the economic power of the economic leg, I would say, of this deep state. Some oligarchs have already given back their wealth to the state. I was less referring to the leaders of the state institutions. My strong persuasion is that this leader should be removed, and it can be removed as well. And instead of these leaders, we should have independent leaders of state institutions who have high professional and integrity standards. With the constitutional majority, because the new government has the constitutional majority, it has 71% in terms of the parliamentary mandates. So with constitutional majority, the new government can do it, and it is quite clear that they want to do it. The new Prime Minister, Péter Magyar, gave a deadline to these leaders of the state institutions to resign until the end of May. So they will have less than a week for that. But if they do not do that, then it's announced on behalf of the government to amend the constitution in order to do that. And in this respect, I would like to refer back to Daniel, to your former remark, whether how can an insider promote a regime change, a former insider to do a regime change. I think that the political will is clearly the regime change, and the guarantee that this political line will continue is that the voter base behind the new prime minister and the TISA party, the new government, is very diverse, and the voters really want more than a government change. They want a regime change, but it will be not without difficulties, as I said. About the anti-corruption reforms, I would mention that it.
Can we begin just 10 seconds because we are running out of time?
Yes, so Hungary is under the conditionality procedure of the European Union, which provides to the new government a pretext and an occasion to pursue meaningful anti-corruption reforms. Here we speak about the 27 rule of law and anti-corruption measures, which Hungary needs to meet in order to unblock the approximately 20 billion euros from the EU budget. So this needs to be done. And again, the endeavor of the government is to go to this direction, and also to joining to EPPO, the European Public Prosecution Office. This is also among the main tasks and endeavors of the new government. Thanks.
Thanks, Joseph. Much appreciated. So go quickly to Sanjita, Jonathan, and Liz very briefly. Sanjita, on the post-state capture recovery, what is the main area of progress, very much in brief, and the main lesson that could be relevant for other countries in terms of recovering from state capture, the recovery process?
I think the main point is that the reform window can be brief, because I understand in South Africa we're talking about ebb and flow, but still that is not guaranteed that political momentum or the people's momentum can last, is not guaranteed. So we have to be conscious that the reform window can be brief, because power consolidates, capture can re-arise, access can get cut off to government, especially in the context of overpowerful governments that come into play. With a strong political people's mandate, we have a two-thirds majority parliament in place now, with a very powerful executive presidency, and the electoral interest can wane over time. So because of that, in terms of the main areas of progress, I think for Sri Lanka, we have seen what I call an activist's dream package of reform, beneficial ownership, asset declarations, money laundering laws, all of these procurement laws getting reformed. But the question remains as to whether it is good reform. So if it is not, the work doesn't stop. So it's natural in moments of a kind of recovery from state capture, post-protest, post-regime change, the civil society to feel like it can take a bit of a rest, but that doesn't change. Honestly, the level of work that you need to keep up, for us at least, has never changed, irrespective of what government's in power. And in terms of reform, I think it comes back to the standard boring anti-corruption toolkit of better transparency, better accountability, managing conflicts of interest, getting those systems in place. I know several of us said this, and then also watching out for early warnings of erosion of this kind of thing, because we can see with any government that comes in with a popular mandate, there may be a tendency then to feel like they have the mandate and act on their own. So, watching out for the erosion of them, because there is still an infrastructure that we have now inherited from a captured state that is ready to take over. One public official said, it's very easy for public officials. We talk about politicians, but public officials will just change the color of their tie to the color of the regime of the day and just move on, right? And they still continue to capture the state. And the last point I'll make is in these moments of regime change, preventing negative networking, the capture of the state by the middle persons or middlemen, and that corrupt network still remains really important. Thanks.
That's so important. These early flags, early warning, and you did it, right? And with your constitutional challenge, which should be a case study. So quickly now to Jonathan, you gave us already a very good general preview. Let's go to one concrete example of major ongoing or pending reform that could make a huge difference in your context. For instance, we have had no mention of the public administration reform bill, or it has a slightly different name. You will tell us, but it goes at the core of one of the trade-offs that Liz was discussing before on the issues of meritocracy and professionalized civil service and so on. How important is that within this broader context? Or you would put priority on something different, but very concretely, like what would that example be that could make a big difference for the future, both in terms of the post-recovery, but also in terms of guardrails in the against reverting to state capture in the future. Very much being mindful that South Africa was a very interesting case of collusion between the oligarchs and the state captors, right? And so.
It's very difficult to do this in these tweets, but yeah, I think so. In terms of the public administration reforms, just two pieces of legislation have just been signed into law at the end of March. The Public Service Amendment Bill, which creates a firewall between members of the executive, the ministers, and the heads of departments. So that's quite a major reform. I think of this as a reforestation project. We've got thousands of little small trees, all needing tending and causing frustration. We do not yet have the benefit of the forest, but it's starting. There are areas starting. So I think the president's response is comprehensive across a full range. We reformed the state security age. We've shifted back to the doctrine of national security as opposed to state security. We're in the process of dismantling the President Zuma era single national state security agency. We've introduced a whole lot of public procurement transparency measures, the establishment of a public procurement office with search and seizure powers. Also, there are too many to enumerate. We have published several, and we are about to publish a new a comprehensive update on this reform effort. But yeah, I think the biggest piece is what's emerging from the Madlanga Commission, this commission into infiltration of the law enforcement agencies. That is going to be a complete game changer. We have an acting police minister who was the head of a advisory council to the president on the anti-corruption reform agenda. So we have a really leading anti-corruption reformer in the police ministry, heading up the police ministry. There's a report from this advisory council, which was civil society led largely, which proposes a independent corruption agency. There's a lot of stuff happening around well, so how does that happen? But there's so many converging elements on this. So to answer what the major one would be the criminal justice reforms.
To promote?
The criminal justice reforms, I would say,
right.
is the
Right. Okay, that's a clear bottom line. Now, Liz has very kindly said that we can go now to the audience. We will come back to Liz and to everybody at the end. We also have the allowance of a few extra minutes, so we will not stop at the hour, but we'll go over by 5 minutes or a bit more because we want the interaction with the audience. Anybody has a question, wants to raise a hand, or feel free to also ask in the chat. But if you also, and I see already Marianne Cameron, our esteemed, another expert from South Africa. Go ahead, Marianne.
Thanks, Danny, and all the panelists. Been absolutely fascinating. But I liked how you linked state capture right in the beginning to democracy. And I think that's why, to me, it is so critical. And just the example coming out of Hungary gives people hope. I mean, all around the world, people were watching that. And just learning about how civil society in other parts of the world is helping get a literacy around some of these concepts like conflict of interest or ethics or governance. So that was really important. I liked what Jonathan said, and maybe I was just hearing it the whole time about the public, right? It was a public document. It was a public process. We're watching this unfold. There's hopefully a public reckoning. And, these various commissions are very important. And I think there's been an evolution from the Zondo Commission, which happened during COVID, for various reasons, to this Madlanga Commission. But I think the challenge is that while it allows the public to see literally alarming and riveting, what's happening, it's better than primetime TV. It allows the public unfiltered to see, the good, the bad, the ugly, the competent, and say, like, who's been running this place, and it's just not on. Does that translate into cynicism and disengagement from the democratic process? And how do we avoid that? So this is what I'm sitting with, the more information around what's going on, and then how that can translate into a positive political gain. And I think it really has to do with the accountability in action, not just the answerability, coming forward and giving the questions and people showing up, but the consequences, right? That there's actually, is that action, and then having a permanent institution. But how not to lose hope through seeing what's unfolding, and how does that then translate into a democratic gain through this whole, as Jonathan says, it's an iterative process. It's not circular, it's messy. But are we moving the needle towards more democracy, essentially? Thanks.
Thank you, Marianne. What I will do is, since there's another question too, this is very important, and the whole issue of the democratic angle is critical. There's another question which came through the chat And in the meantime, if somebody else will raise their hands, then we'll collect the questions and then we'll have a final round afterwards with each of one of you panelists, which will address the questions that you think relevant, and if you have a brief concluding remark. So one question is, what about having from Heather Haschlinger to what about having independent anti-corruption units in these countries paid by parliament and not the prosecuting authority? Also, do you think in a country with compromised prosecution that private prosecution is an option through civil society, especially in the Zondo Commission context? Thanks. And and then to what extent, what ways can external actors help? World Bank, IMF, EU. For Sri Lanka concretely, what about the role of the IMF program in this respect, which has been very, very involved there, and EU obviously in the case of Hungary. And then in fragile or transitional contexts, how do we distinguish between an elite bargain that temporarily stabilizes a political system and state capture that entrenches private in interest? So it's a set of related questions that maybe they would go first to Liz, because I didn't give you you didn't have the second round, and you can comment on those that you think are relevant for you, plus what you have heard after your very, very brilliant comments on the research you're doing. And then I will go into the actors. I will just comment very quickly in terms of some of these questions and the comments by others. It raises the issue that you and I have discussed many times of how the whole field of state capture has evolved, being very narrow in the early days when we looked at post-Soviet and the post-Soviet oligarchs, but now to account for the capture not of the state by the oligarchs, but capture by the state leader, right? But of course, in so many contexts now, it's a collusion between both. So would the recommendations and these trade-offs you're talking about be very different for one type or the other? Because it's very different if it's capture of the state by the oligarchs or capture by the state leader, mostly in terms of the asymmetry of power.
Right, lots of questions there, very little time. To sort of perhaps go to that last one and a sort of overarching comment, I do think it's very important to contextualize all of this. So, we don't want to make the mistake here of thinking there's some one-size-fits-all solution. State capture manifests in different ways, in different contexts. We do think that there are important similarities, which make it analytically useful to consider them as all having some structural similarities. But I do think also it's important to go in and do a kind of country diagnosis about what's needed. And that would include that question of who's driving the process. Having said that, the mechanisms are often quite similar. So I think there are some mechanisms which are more accessible to politically based captors. But the mechanisms are kind of similar, and maybe a good example of that actually is if we look at the South Africa case. So normally I would say if it's a politically driven capture, then one power that politicians have is this power of appointment. They can put their people into these key agencies. But if you look at South Africa, the Guptas were very influential in actually managing to influence how Zuma did that. So yes, there are differences, but actually, if you look at it at the mechanism level, it's often that there are quite a lot of similarities that can feed how we think about what do we need to reform to prevent those kinds of things happening again. I'll just say a very quick thing about the external actors, because one of the aspects of the project that I'm working on, particularly with Tom Shipley, is around the role of the IMF, which has taken much greater interest in this issue of systemic corruption and state capture in the last few years. We think that's important because the IMF is often a very important actor with a lot of leverage, and they're really interesting case from some of these countries, in particular from Sri Lanka, around the potential then to have this kind of three-way dialogue with the IMF and the government and civil society. It's, it also has challenges. The IMF's main interlocutor is obviously the government. So it's not straightforward, but it does, I think, open up a really interesting channel. The World Bank is often very important in providing some of the assistance for the reforms. The EU's got a very mixed record, I must say, on this. The EU has, does not come out well in terms of how it has responded in Hungary. It's slightly improving the situation now, but also in the Western Balkans, often really not very helpful. I'll stop there.
Thanks. So we're going in reverse order. So we go now to Jonathan. And there was some particularly on South Africa, but some brief responses on that. And then we'll go to Sangeeta and to Joseph too.
Sorry, I couldn't find the mute button. No, I think I think the narrative around no prosecutions in South Africa is not true. I think we are tracking at a recommendation level the progress of prosecutions, which is taking place in parallel to the re-establishment of the prosecuting authority. There were questions around private prosecutions, international criminal courts. I don't think there's a way around building state capacity. I don't think there's an external solution that can do this. Unless you've been conquered by a conquering sort of army, you can't. It's not going to work. So you have to do the hard work of building the consensus within the society. But we are seeing big names, big political names in court now. It's taking much longer than people would like to see, but it's happening. I think we just need to really always keep in mind in terms of the role of international finance organizations, we need to really recognize that countries are not the same, that we live in a global and totally interconnected world system in many ways. And we need to recognize histories. State capture in South Africa doesn't start with the Zuma presidency. State capture starts as a colonial project. Even in the formation of the state, it has in its essence a kind of capturing of resources towards a certain a metropole, let's say. But so I think we need to keep looking at the broader context to really get to what matters. For me, the great case study at the moment is what's been happening in the US. How do we use our experiences in the spaces that we have experienced them to apply the thinking about what's happening in such a powerful space? So yeah, sorry, maybe not so coherent, and I will stop just without making the point.
Yeah, I think for another session, perhaps, Liz, is the elephant in the room that has been mentioned by Jonathan, and I brought it up, and it's interesting that you mentioned that one way of getting external impact is a conquering army, which is quite poignant. So we go now to Sangeeta. Just
Yes.
to the most relevant ones that you feel it's for you in brief, please. Some feedback.
Sure.
And I have to note that there are other questions coming. We'll see. I think we are over time there, but I am acknowledging them, including about the usefulness of an international anti-corruption court and how to not fall into witch hunt of the previous regime in the new regime. And I'm sure Joseph can comment on that as well. But Sangeeta, on to you.
Yes. Acknowledging what Jonathan said, that short of a conquering army, we need to build systems. One thing I'll say is something we've built into our Proceeds of Crime Act in Sri Lanka that was passed post, uprising and regime change, where we actually built in a provision for civil society to be able to make a claim for damages from the state, even in the absence of state action. So even if you can't prosecute and garner convictions, whether you can recover the losses suffered due to corruption and state capture. So we've now built it into law for just a moment like state capture re-arising in the future, because when we run out of options to at least fortify the courts in a reasoned process to be able to make some kind of stake or claim. On the question of Sri Lanka and the role of international organizations, I know it's a simple point, but I say this, it's really important to have conversations with the IFIs as early as possible and align what they're saying with what civil society has been asking for, what the contextual situation is on the ground, so that it can act as a useful instrument of reform, and then keeping those conversations alive, even as much as you feel like a stranger in the room half of the time, like you're unwelcome, not because the IMF or the agencies not welcoming, but because, as Liz mentioned, the main interlocutor is the state. So you will forever be the outsider, but there's still a lot that can be done if you're willing to keep working. Stop.
Great. Thanks, Sangeeta. Joseph, the last word. So we all go back full circle. We start with Hungary and we end with Hungary.
Thank you for that. So I will be very brief, or at least try to be. So about the question of witch hunt, I would couple with the question about the elite bargain versus state capture. So I think the guarantee to avoid witch hunt and also what state capture is differentiated from elite bargain is the independence of the institutions. So that is for sure the crucial issue. In state capture, we did not have independence of the institutions. In democracy, we should have first and foremost the independence of the judiciary, because at the end of the day, the judiciary should say the final verdict about the corrupt perpetrators, about asset recovery, and about who is sinner and who is not. So independence of the institution is crucial. Second point about the anti-corruption institutions, there was a question whether it should be subordinated to the parliament or to the government. We foresee in Hungary one or might be even two anti-corruption institutions, but probably one in the near future, a new one. And according to the announcement so far, it will be subordinated to the parliament, so it will report to the Hungarian parliament. I think it's a wise idea. And thirdly, about my last comment about the public involvement. So in Hungary, as I tried to show, there is a political momentum now. So there is a strong political will on behalf of the new government to pursue deep anti-corruption reforms. I would also go to such extent that a big bang type of anti-corruption reform can be foreseen in the near future. There is the public support for that, and there is most probably, or there will be most probably, the EU backing. But to achieve the necessary goal with all this nice setup, we need the public participation. We need the civil society to be involved in this whole process. If it will be done, then it will be for a long term on the benefit of the country. Thank you.
I mean, this is uplifting to be able to end with this positive note, and there was some order in the madness in trying to finish with you all as well, and the case of Hungary. But we have learned a lot also from Sri Lanka. The case of Sri Lanka and South Africa are fascinating. The customary expression of that I'm not going to even try to summarize applies not only because of the fantastic richness and diversity of views and discussion, not only because we are totally out of time and then some, but because today either Claude or ChatGPT would do it so much better than I could even try to do it. So without further ado, and because we have stretched the time, and thanks so much to all the audience and to the great questions, and sorry for some of the questions we didn't have full answers. Very relevant question in the International Anti-Corruption Court, which has been a question and an issue for so long. One of the issues I've raised in the past is that how it can also help for state capture and not just for high-level state corruption. So with that, let's all give a thumbs up and cheers to the great panelists.